I grew up in Birmingham, and so I know as well as anyone that the city hasn't always enjoyed the best reputation. But the truth is, it's a city unrecognisable from the bad old days. And I'd like to think that, slowly but surely, this might just be sinking into the national consciousness. You might go so far as to say that suddenly, being Brummie is cool. This is the Library of Birmingham, which opened in 2013 to great fanfare. Now, if this isn't an homage to great literature, I don't know what is. The thing is, though, does Birmingham have a literary heritage to go with such an impressive building? It's England's second city, but has there ever been a great novelist who's done for Birmingham what Joyce did for Dublin, Dickens for London, or Zola for Paris?
Not many people have written about it, whereas, you know, scores, hundreds of writers have written about London.
People assume that writers don't come from around here.
I sometimes have the sense that everybody in the country looks down on Birmingham.
What you do have a lot of is, oh, you've got that accent. You know, oh, she says laugh instead of laugh, or whatever. You know, it's just a slight bit of attitude sometimes. But, you know, I'm from Birmingham, so you get used to that.
When it comes to creating a place's identity, art and literature play a huge part. So I want to know what the writers who've written about Birmingham have done to help create the city's image and identity. I also want to know what's it like to be a writer from Birmingham, away from the throng of the literati in London. And above all, I want to know what the great Birmingham novel is. Or perhaps it's yet to be written. Let's go back to the 1800s, a boom period for the novel. Dickens, the Brontes, Austen, Eliot, Hardy. A sense of place was key to many of these writers. But where was the great Birmingham novel? After all, in the 1800s, Birmingham was a city on the up, the city of 1,000 trades, the city that could make almost anything you could think of in one of its myriad factories. Surely this was a city that could churn out at least one best-selling novelist? Well, there were literary figures associated with the city. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle spent a lot of time here, for instance. Some even say he drew a fair bit of inspiration from the city. But overall, when it comes to the Victorian novel, Birmingham didn't fare too well. There's a particularly damning reference that perhaps hints at national opinion in Jane Austen's Emma, when the snobbish Mrs. Elton proclaims,
"Birmingham is not a place to promise much. One has no great hopes of Birmingham. I always say there is something direful in that sound."
The Victorian era turned into the Edwardian, and the modernist writers reflected the fragile world around them. In London, the Bloomsbury set were blossoming, James Joyce was immortalising Dublin, and yet still there was no great Birmingham novel. By the end of the 1920s, though, there was hope. Henry Green was born in 1905, the son of a wealthy Birmingham industrialist. His first novel, Living, portrayed life in a Birmingham factory and focused primarily on the lives of the workers.
What's extraordinary about that novel, a novel that in its day was very well received, and he was considered to be the equal of D.H. Lawrence and was going to do for perhaps for Birmingham what those writers like D.H. Lawrence had done for their own communities. He was a man who ran factories, who was involved in the manufacturing class, who was very much involved in the city in its industrial sense, and yet he chooses also to be a writer.
Green's prose was stripped of many common words, mirroring the bland, stilted and difficult world experienced by the workers.
He left out a lot of the grammatical elements of formal English to produce this sense of a local patois, almost.
Bridesley, Birmingham, 2 o'clock. Thousands came back from dinner along streets. Thousands came back to factories they worked in from their dinners. Noises of lathes working began again in this factory. Hundreds went along road outside, men and girls.
Although Green still attracts high praise from some quarters, how many of us can honestly say we know his works? I'll confess, he's not a writer I'm particularly aware of. But green wasn't the only Birmingham hope.
There was, in fact, a group in the 30s known as the Birmingham School, who not many of them are remembered now, but they wrote about Birmingham and about working people very often. And that was a period in the 30s when there was an interest in the representation of working class life.
After the Second World War, things began to pick up for Brum's literary scene, helped in part by the emergence of a new type of novel, the campus novel. Novels like Kingsley Amis's Lucky Jim, published in 1954, were proving immensely popular, and with a thriving red brick university of its own, Birmingham was ripe for literary treatment. It was here, at the University of Birmingham in the 1960s, that the young David Lodge took a job. He'd just had his first novel published and was one of a number of novelist academics at the time writing about university life.
It seemed very strange to me, a Londoner, when I came here, a very grey provincial city. Couldn't understand what anybody was saying to me in the street and so on. But I've become a kind of adopted Brummie, I think, through writing about Birmingham.
Many of Lodge's novels are set in the fictionalised city of Rummidge, based very openly on Birmingham.
I suppose in those days I still felt I was a Londoner who'd come to Birmingham. I didn't feel like I belonged to it. So I perhaps used or took the liberty of satirising certain features of Birmingham. And then as I stayed and got to know the city better, and got to know it in particular when I decided to write directly about the situation in Birmingham at the time of the early 80s. And I decided to write a more realistic novel, really, called Nice Work, eventually, about work and what it meant to people and what it meant if it was threatened. So then my sort of attitude to my literary stance towards Birmingham has changed somewhat during the 40, 50, 60 years. I forgot how long I've been here.
In Nice Work, published in 1988, the worlds of academia and industry square off, with immigration, Thatcher and capitalism as a backdrop.
I had to do the research, which was very interesting, and I learned a lot. And in a way, my young heroine, Robin, her experience is mirroring my own as I was taken around foundries and factories.
One of the most striking passages of the book for me was when Robin made a journey to the factory and went through a part of town she'd never visited before. And it might have been set in Rummidge, but it was so obviously Stratford Road, Coventry Road, Handsworth, that sort of place.
She's off the ring road, she's lost. The names on the shop fronts are all Asian. Nanda General Stores, Sabar Sweet Centre, Ranjit Brothers Import Export, Punjabi Printers Limited, Usha Sari Centre. She takes a left turn at random and finds herself in an area of derelict buildings burnt out and boarded up. The site, she realises, of the previous year's rioting. Caribbean faces now preponderate on the pavement. How strange it is, strange and sad to see all these tropical faces amid the slush and dirty snow. The grey, gritty hopelessness of an English industrial city in the middle of winter.
You know, as a writer, rejoiced in the opportunities for description that gave. You know, it was like a novelist getting involved in a battle or something and seeing what that was really like.
I'm sorry I'm late. I'm afraid I got lost. Oh. Well, I've never been to this part of Rummidge before.
Lodge himself adapted the novel for a television series starring Warren Clarke, Hayden Gwynne and Birmingham itself.
I thought the helicopter shots of Spaghetti Junction were absolutely brilliant, and I had a lot of fun with the music to the book, to that film too. They were all those tunes, the pop songs that Vic Wilcox, the hero, listens to on his car radio, and the soaring voices of these singers and the wonderful swirling movement of the helicopter above Spaghetti Junction somehow made Birmingham seem really, important, a really spectacular place.
Whilst Lodge chose to write about a fictionalised version of the city, One author who wrote very specifically about it, having grown up in Birmingham, was Jonathan Coe. Many would say his book, The Rotters Club, published in 2001, has a strong claim to be the definitive Birmingham novel.
Well, I wanted to write an autobiographical novel, a novel set in my teenage years. But I realised that would mean it would also be about two other things, which is the 1970s themselves as a political era, and about Birmingham. And, you know, that idea appealed to me because, as far as I knew, there hadn't been many novels set in that place during that era.
The Rotters Club is a coming-of-age novel. It's set against a backdrop of the declining motor industry in Birmingham, the soaring music scene, industrial strife, and the IRA pub bombings.
Well, as soon as I knew the book was going to be set in Birmingham in the 70s, I knew that the pub bombings had to figure in some way or another. My family wasn't directly affected by them, but everybody knew somebody who had some kind of connection with that event. I knew it was going to be a difficult thing to write about because it's real. The consequences were real and are still unfolding even now. I mean, that story isn't closed. But you know, it's part of the Birmingham narrative, the Birmingham mythology of the 1970s. You couldn't leave it out, and you couldn't make it anything but central, actually.
In one fateful scene, the unfortunate Malcolm takes his girlfriend Lois to a central Birmingham pub to propose.
I've got to say something to you. I've got to ask you something. He grasped her hand and squeezed it tightly as if he would never let it go. Do you know what it is? Of course she knew, and of course Malcolm knew what her answer would be. They understood each other perfectly at that moment. They were as close to each other and as close to happiness as it's possible for two people to be. Then at 8:20 precisely, the timing device set off the trigger. The battery pack sent power running through the cables and 30 pounds of gelignite exploded on the far side of the pub.
At times in the Rotters Club, you'd seem quite down on Birmingham. Is that how you saw it and how you still see it?
It wasn't how I saw it at all. Birmingham was my universe in the 70s, and it wasn't until I left to go to Cambridge and then eventually to London that I realised that there were other takes on the city, and that most people didn't see it through quite the kind of rose-tinted spectacles that I did. And I wanted to reflect that attitude in the Rotters Club. People from Birmingham don't celebrate their city as loudly and as unapologetically as they might. And you know, in the closing pages of the Rotters Club, it was never my intention to do this. I didn't really have any plans for that passage, but what I ended up writing, quite spontaneously in a way, was this 30-page stream of consciousness where Benjamin is sitting in a pub, the Grapevine, I don't know if it's still there, in Paradise Place, and he suddenly finds himself wanting to run out into the streets and shout at the top of his voice, "I love this city, I love this city." And I kind of put that in really because I thought it was the most sort of Birmingham thing that anybody would want to do, to actually, you know, be so upfront about it.
I'm sitting in Paradise Place and looking into the Hall of Memory, and suddenly it's as if the entire city has become nothing less than a life-size diagram of our hearts, and I can almost shout with the joy of it. I want to run out into the square and shout to anyone who will listen. I love this city. I love this city. But as you might have guessed, I'm not going to do that. It's not exactly in character.
I kind of found my voice in that book, and the reason I hadn't found it before was that I hadn't allowed myself really to be in touch with my roots in this part of the world, and I think that that was a very liberating experience, and it brought something to my writing that it hadn't had before.
The scene of rural idyll laid out before them might have given rise to any number of reflections. Although they were only a mile or two from Longbridge and Birmingham's outer suburbs, the gently undulating countryside, with its indolent nodding herds and tiny hedgerows, might have inspired a Betchman to verse or a Butterworth to composition. The pastoral stillness remained undisturbed for several minutes until Philip asked, "How often do you think about girls with no clothes on?" Benjamin gave this question the serious thought it deserved. "Quite often," he said. "All the time, in fact."
Another Birmingham writer of interest is Jim Crace, but whether he writes about Birmingham or not is the subject of much debate.
When he wrote about the city, he chose to write about using other metaphors in order to explain what's happening in the city. So possibly people weren't aware that he was also writing about Birmingham, that he was very much a writer influenced by the city in which he'd ended up in.
He writes more obliquely about Birmingham. In a novel like Arcadia, for instance, there's no mention of Birmingham, but that's what it inspires it, and the building that went on in Birmingham, often rather insensitive building, particularly in the 60s, 70s.
I remember him telling me once that the image which opens Quarantine, which is a series of cave mouths in a rock wall in the middle of the desert, that image came to him when he was staring out of his window at a building opposite where he was writing, and all the glass in all the windows had been broken. And it was a very, very urban image which he'd transmuted and made into something completely different.
Crace also drew inspiration from the declining car industry in the Midlands, a period he is said to have reflected in The Gift of Stones, a novel set on the cusp of the Bronze Age, far removed from late 20th century Birmingham.
Those of us who have kicked an anthill will understand the chaos in the village. The dreaming ants, so used to patterns and chores, had been sent wild and spirited by the unheralded disorder of the day.
Crace, Lodge and Co. have all won numerous awards throughout their careers, proving that Birmingham can produce highly rated novelists.
But what's it like being a new Birmingham writer in the 21st century?
Anna Lawrence Pietroni and Kit Duvall have both published their first novels in the past few years and certainly see many positives to being Birmingham writers.
It's a major city, but you can get places through quite quickly.
Yes.
So actually, I think that's a huge advantage for us. Is that
Absolutely.
so there's that we can get together as writers and share our work really easily,
Yes.
and just kind of meet for coffee. In ways that certainly when I lived in London, it would have been much, much more challenging to kind of have that community on your doorstep.
Yeah.
And I think we do have a really rich community of writers on our doorstep,
Yeah.
which is fantastic.
Absolutely.
But there are clear challenges to being based in the Midlands.
I wanted to get an agent. By and large, agents are in London. And it is sometimes a case of they say, oh, pop in and see me. Well, if you're in Birmingham, that's expensive. It's not just across town. And you do sometimes meet agents at literary events. And again, some of those literary events are in London. And so it can be a challenge. It can be more of a challenge if you want to be published and the big publishing houses are in London. That's not to say that's not going to happen if you're in Birmingham.
We've got the will and we've got the talent, and it's about having the kind of writing infrastructure, the publishing infrastructure. It's about how do we do things which get the agents here.
A cynic might say it's about more than just a lack of agents, though.
I mean, I had the experience where when I had a friend who was an agent based in New York, who was wanted to represent my first novel, and she felt that because my novel was based in the West Midlands, in the Black Country, that it would be much, much easier to sell it in America first, where people didn't have those preconceptions and prejudices about a place that about the Midlands.
For me, I wouldn't know how to write any other way than being somebody from Birmingham and my experiences here and my sensibilities being in my writing. The novel I've written, My Name is Leon, is about a 10-year-old boy who goes into care and who has a particularly grievous, unhappy experience. And part of what I was writing about is this child being dislocated and abandoned and feeling completely out of his depth and lost. So I purposely didn't make it Birmingham. I didn't say at any point which city it was. I was writing about the city, the underbelly of the city, which is the same wherever you are. So my experiences of living in Birmingham, living an urban life, are in my writing, are in my book. And if it has a resonance with the rest of the country, that's great. And I think it just demonstrates how you don't have to be from or in London to write about things that matter to people.
But at the same time, you did write about the Handsworth riots. Well,
yes.
The Handsworth riots
I wrote about riots.
Riots. They were based on the Handsworth riots. Why?
They were based on the riots I knew and I experienced, which happened to be the Handsworth riots.
Two men in turbans shout at him. Get off the street, can't you see? Go home. Don't run away, they say. But Leon is too quick. Something whizzes over his head, and when it smashes, it explodes into a puddle of fire, the flames jumping high off the street. Leon turns and runs, and then he sees them. Crowds and crowds of black men at the end of the street, surging forward and back like one wild lion about to pounce. Leon stares at them, but they are looking past him to the other end of the road where there's a wide wall of shields and truncheons. Hundreds of policemen lined up across the street. The words through the loudspeaker are angry. Clear the street! Disperse and clear the street!
Certainly when I've done events in London, people have come to me and said, I was living on that road when those riots were on. And they lived in Tottenham or Brixton. So to me, that demonstrates the universality of that experience of the riots. And there were riots in Bristol and in Liverpool and in Manchester and in Leeds. And so, generally speaking, the riots felt about the same thing, the oppression, the disenfranchisement of the black community. It felt the same wherever you were. Of course, it's the Handsworth riots in that I was living there. So I remember the cars burning on the streets. I remember the feeling that was in the air that I tried to capture through Leon's eyes. So yeah, it's the Handsworth riots because that's what I experienced, but I don't name the Handsworth riots. So it's a novel about lots and lots of things. It's certainly a novel inspired by Birmingham, in that it came from me and I'm inspired by Birmingham.
And Kit herself has become an inspiration.
What she will do, almost most importantly, is she will act as a role model for other writers. People will meet her, read her book, see her at work and realise that they too can be writers. They can come from this city, come from that part of the city and become writers.
So there are plenty of great books that have come out of Birmingham, and there are plenty I haven't mentioned that would make many people's lists.
But as for the great Birmingham novel, perhaps I've missed one. I'm talking hobbits, I'm talking wizards, I'm talking orcs, I'm talking J.R.R. Tolkien.
In the land of Mordor, in the fires of Mount Doom, the Dark Lord Sauron forged in secret a master ring.
It was a revelation a few decades ago when people started to more closely associate Tolkien with Birmingham and to realise that it wasn't just a place where he happened to live, but actually there were things about the city which must have influenced the way in which he created this world in which he wrote about.
The Lord of the Rings trilogy has sold tens of millions of copies worldwide and been voted the most popular novel of all time.
Young Tolkien grew up here in the late 1890s in what was then known as the village of Sarehole. It's now very much part of Birmingham, but there are still a few reminders of the world Tolkien knew.
Now a museum, Sarehole Mill was less than 300 yards from where Tolkien lived and was the epicentre of his world, and many believe this area was a key inspiration for the Shire.
So how important was this area to Tolkien?
It was very important, and when he moved here in 1896 from South Africa, he was confronted with a different world to the world that he knew. He was confronted with the Worcestershire countryside. And as a young boy, him and his young brother Hilary would often spend their entire summers, in their own words, just trespassing and picking flowers. And all the lanes around here would be places that they'd go and visit and would know. And in later life, Tolkien would say he could map every single inch of it from memory.
Do we see Birmingham crop up in the texts?
We do. You only have to look at the mill just behind me to see one of the big influences on Tolkien, and that is of Sarehole Mill itself. From his front door, he'd be able to look over the pool and see it, and he'd be around the banks of the pool, paddling feet, climbing the trees, and eventually being chased off by one of the millers, George Andrew Jr., who they called the White Ogre, who we believe was inspired the infamous Ted Sandeman, the Hobbit miller. Another aspect of the influence is that of dialect and of language, and Tolkien would have spoken differently to the local children. And one of those words that is really relevant to The Lord of the Rings is what the children would have called cotton wool at the time, which would have known as a Gamgee gauze, after its maker, Sam Gamgee, which later on featured into the character Samwise Gamgee.
I made a promise, Mr. Frodo. A promise. Don't you leave him, Samwise Gamgee. And I don't mean to.
To me, Tolkien is not just a Birmingham writer, but probably the greatest Birmingham writer of the last century. And Lord of the Rings, you know, one way of reading it, a kind of realistic way of reading it, is as a classic provincial novel of two local boys who leave their home city, venture out into the wider world, encounter dangers, unfamiliarity, and achieve great things and come back in triumph. It's you know, it's a great novel of the provincial boys made good.
I think what's also interesting is the tone of lament that can be detected. Read a certain way, the descriptions of the Shire, with its simple, old-fashioned way of life, can certainly be seen as a tribute to a bygone era, an era that Tolkien knew and loved during his time in Birmingham. But I admit, Birmingham might not have been the only influence on Tolkien's work. Oxford, Leeds, and plenty of other places he lived in or visited will all stake at least a Hobbit-sized claim.
But I think we can celebrate Tolkien as the most successful Birmingham writer of all time. And in terms of sales, he is going to take some beating. But can we really count Lord of the Rings as the great Birmingham novel?
Perhaps that's delving a little too far into the world of fantasy. But is there a great Birmingham novel then?
The great Birmingham novel has not yet been written. There is somebody in a library or in a university room or in a back bedroom who's writing the great novel of Birmingham. But at the same time, Birmingham is perhaps too big to have one great novel. We need dozens of great novels, and we will have them, just as London has dozens of different novels that represent the city.
Although the books we've looked at are all very different, they've all helped reflect important parts of the Birmingham mythology throughout the years, and their success proves there is an appetite for the city's stories.
The Literature Festival, the Birmingham Literature Festival, I suppose, is the spiritual heart of our...
And that's also plain to see from the passion of the city's reading and writing community at large. Every year, Birmingham hosts a literature festival showcasing existing and new talent from around the region and beyond.
We brought our baggage, basketballs and bicycles into the hall, laid out keys and bus passes on a table that took the weight of our anger.
He says he would have told Maddie how it all started. How he first saw the girl waiting at the bus stop, scrawling something into the mist and spray, rain and breath on the Perspex shelter.
Just being here, you can really tell that people in Birmingham do care about writing, and there is a thriving literary scene. And for a city with such a rich history and so many cultures, how can there not be more great Birmingham novels to come?
Take a little walk to the edge of town and go across the tracks, where the viaduct looms like a bird of doom as it shifts and cracks, where secrets lie in the border fires and the humming wires. Yeah, man, you know you're never coming back. Across the square, past the bridge, past the mills, past the stacks.
What's the book you'd recommend? Share your suggestion using the hashtag #LoveToRead and see what other books people are talking about.
Black coat with a red right hand.